So basically what the sectorial balance proves, if you believe the assumptions and the mathematics that we've got in the model, it's that a 7% reduction in government spending can only come from a 7% reduction in spending from Scotland's households and businesses. And that has another name. That's called austerity.
Yeah. In this episode of the MMT 101 podcast, I'm delighted to be chatting to economist William Thomson, who is the co-founder with Kieran van Sweden of the Scotonomics organisation. On their website, the Scotonomics aims are described as exploring how our economic system really works and how it could work better. And of course there's a lot more text on there explaining that further, but that's my summary based on what's on the website. William is an individual who has, through his energy and commitment, become a leading character in Scotland's heterodox economics community, spreading the word about how we can use our knowledge about the economy to make people's lives better. As well as organising the many conferences in Scotland, which prior to William and Kieran's activities, I don't believe we've had that many economics conferences in Scotland. Even managing to do that is a kind of novel thing for us all. It's good that William and Kieran exist in order to bring these conferences to us. And he's also been busy writing and co-writing discussion papers and articles on Scotland's economy, including the one we are going to chat about today, which is called Undermining Economic Resilience: The Economic Impact of Adopting the European Union's Stability and Growth Pact in an Independent Scotland. Some people would say that's a mouthful. I think it's just a good description of what's in the paper. He co-wrote the paper with one of my previous podcast guests and one of my favourite economists, one of my favourite MMT economists, Dr. Dirk Ehnst, E-H-N-T-S. Dirk Ehnst is a German heterodox economist and an accredited parliamentary assistant at the European Parliament in Brussels. As well as chatting about the paper that they've both written together, William will also be telling me about his up-and-coming Festival of Economics called, quite literally, Scotland's Festival of Economics. That's on from March 19th to the 21st, 2026. And I myself will be attending on the Thursday session. Okay, that's enough for me blabbing on. Okay, here's me chatting to economist William Thomson. Okay, William, welcome to the MMT 101 podcast. Very happy to have you on here.
Thanks, Tim. Good to see you again, mate.
Yeah, good to see you. We did originally talk about, this was a couple of months ago, was it? I first got in touch, and you had just published a paper with Dirk Ehnst, economist Dirk Ehnst, who I've also had on the podcast in the past. He's one of my favourite.
Yeah, Dirk's great.
MMT economists. So that, as far as I'm aware, is what we're going to chat about today. Is that right? Now, because you haven't been on the MMT podcast before, I thought maybe I would ask you a wee bit about yourself, and a wee bit about your background and how you got into economics. And I know you run the Scotonomics organisation, so you can tell us a wee teeny bit about that as well.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I suppose the best place to start for me is that I studied economics at university in the 90s, and it was a solidly neoclassical school of economics, like it is everywhere now. And I wasn't aware that I was studying one school of economics. I just thought I was studying economics. And when I went to university, I was not exposed to anything other than a kind of neoclassical orthodox education in economics. And at the end of the year, I pretty much thought, this is useless. This is all complete nonsense. Yeah. It's not telling me anything about the world and how to fix it. And I went off and I did a management degree instead, which was like, how do companies actually work? Let's speak to someone who runs a company rather than with economics saying, well, let's draw a diagram and make loads of assumptions. So I really fell away with economics after university. And then I had my kind of career in London, but I worked in financial services. So I was dealing a lot with, I worked for the British Bankers Association and the Council of Mortgage Lenders. So I was heavily involved in creating all the education and learning and conferences and events and documents and brochures for right through to mortgage-backed securities, through to credit derivatives and bonds and loads of stuff around mortgages, investments. We did lots of stuff on over indebtedness and debt. So I was kind of in financial services, but not kind of providing any of the products or anything like that. So that really gave me a good understanding of the financial system, services, how it worked. And then kind of come the referendum in Scotland and the campaign for the referendum, I got really back involved in economics, and I thought, if Scotland's an independent nation, can it afford to pay for things? Will we be successful? And then that led me down to a very kind of fairly progressive common route, where I'm starting to look at a lot of left-wing economists' views, and then they eventually ended up kind of after the referendum a few years later, kind of discovering MMT and finding that as a really useful lens to look at the economy. And I did a couple of master's degrees. So I did a science master's in the green economy, and then a master's in the economics of sustainability to kind of further kind of solidify my knowledge around the economy. Whilst I was doing that, I set up Scotonomics in Scotland, and a small event which has now turned into Scotland's biggest economics festival in Edinburgh. There's 25 years, 30 years.
No,
Jim,
I mean,
there you go.
Some of that kind of mirrors my own kind of experience. I mean, I did politics and economics, so I did a bit of economics. And I do remember similar kind of thoughts when I was doing that. I mean, I suppose one of the things that affected me, actually, the tutors I had actually were very good. Both my politics and my economics tutors were really good, nice people. I really enjoyed, kind of got on well with them. So I didn't really have a kind of negative thinking about economics, but I did remember thinking, I'm not sure how this connects with what I see going on around about me. It's all, as you say, diagrams, theory, stuff that sounded like unrealistic to me, in terms of the real world. Yeah. And then the capitalists,
we went into kind of, it's really heavily into maths as well. Right. And the second year economics was basically like a maths degree. Right. And I just thought, again, I don't see how maths helps me understand or explain the problems that I see day to day. And I just couldn't relate to that on that level. And loads of economists, even a lot of political economists like Steve Keen, John Harvey, are incredibly up on the maths and can understand it better or as well as any orthodox economist. But it just never really, I never wanted that to be how I explained the economy to people. Why have you not got a job? Let me put it into an equation. I just couldn't see how that could help me communicate with the people that I knew and explain to them how the economy isn't working for them. So I chose another approach, I think, to the economy that helps me communicate to the people that I deal with, and that is that's a heterodox framing. Yeah, no,
it's interesting. I mean, there are obviously lots of things there that don't reflect what I did. I wasn't in financial services, of course. And I couldn't have become an economist based on that kind of mathematics approach. I don't have that particular aptitude, I have to say. I can understand things if I look at them long enough, but it's not something I've got that kind of talent for, the maths and all that, and for economics. But I can understand the way more of a heterodox and modern monetary theory way approaches it, which is more about looking at what's in front of you, looking at the institutions, looking at the way the money flows between the institutions, looking at the more kind of basic models, and like you mentioned in your paper, the different sectors, sector approach. That's simple arithmetic that you can understand.
Absolutely.
So I can understand stuff like that.
It's understanding that, systems dynamics is a really good framing as well, because what's more important is to understand the flows and the impacts than the exact numbers. If you know something's increasing and you can be 100% confident of that, that's much more useful than saying it's increasing by 32.57%. And you've spent so much time trying to get that 32.57% figure that I think you've kind of missed the forest. And that's why I like systems dynamics. So you can say things like, if you put interest rates up past 5 or 6%, you're likely to be increasing inflation. You can say, can you define that in a clear, mathematically proofed model? No, but you can understand, you can look at how the economy, financial flows in the economy to see that that's probably something that's happening. And I think those insights are so much more useful than spending, I said, months trying to come up with an exact figure, which might be precisely wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose on the other hand, I can understand the appeal of orthodox economics in terms of that mathematical approach and that kind of diagrammatic. It's got a world that you can just disappear into, and there's endless ways of modelling things and looking at things, and kind of endless functions that you can mess about with variables, and it's it's got an appeal to it. And I can imagine,
especially to policymakers.
Yeah, and so when you're in it and you've done it for many, many years, and you kind of understand all the levers, then I can also understand why people might not want to come out of it and say, so you want me to leave this complex world of functions and to come and look at your very simplistic 2 and 2 equals 4 world? No, I don't think I'll bother with that.
Absolutely. And if you're dealing with a policymaker, and this is one of the big issues that orthodox economists need to address, if you're dealing with a policymaker, they say to you, what impact will this plan have, right? And you'll say it'll increase government expenditure, and they'll say, well, by how much, right? And what an orthodox economist will say very confidently, they'll say, I've run the model and it'll increase it by 17.5%. And they go, okay, that's great, orthodox economists. What about you heterodox economists? You're like, you can't model something like that. It's too dynamic. Who are they going to listen to if you're a policymaker? They're like, well, I need to go with a guy who's giving me a figure. Even though it's just made up based on assumptions which aren't real. So it's really difficult.
That's the thing, isn't it? I mean, I've written about that, this idea about what is it. Neoliberal economics, I just happen to be writing about at the moment because it's going to be one of the things I'm in my post, my Substack post at some point. Based on assumptions which are unrealistic, based on assumptions which are ideological, based on assumptions about human behaviour, which is complete and utter nonsense, and then models are built on top of these assumptions. So you've got these complex models, which is where we're now looking at. Nobody asks you about the assumptions that are underneath it, which are just wobbly legs, basically, like in a big building. The building has gone up and it's beautiful, and we see it's wavering in the wind a bit. Well, I wonder why it's wavering in the wind a bit. Well, because the damn front, the stuff at the bottom, is not solid. And to me, that's a bit like what particularly neoliberal economics is about. It's like the foundations aren't solid, yet, you're pronouncing these things as if that's the be-all, end-all, and that's how it works. Well, it doesn't work like that, It works. It's a kind of cyclical thing. You've made the assumptions which make the predictions, which predict the predictions, so to speak.
Absolutely. I think John Harvey's got a really good line, and he says something like, orthodox economics is fantastic until you start to use it to model policy. Right. And that's exactly where it is, because it's so kind of abstract that you can say, well, if the world does work like that, then that helps me make decisions. But I have to realize that the real world doesn't work like that. So how do I then adapt those things that come out of the orthodox models for the real world? But that's not what happens. It comes out of the models and people go, great, we'll make those policy decisions based on the assumptions that the models they're giving us. And that's what the huge mistake is. One of my favourite economists is Paul Ormerod, he's an English economist, and he wrote a brilliant book called Butterfly Economics. And he says, he's a heterodox economist, and he said basically the defining feature of the economy is that people are influenced by other decisions that people make. And he said that's a defining part of the economy. The neoclassical economy assumes that we are not influenced in any way by the decisions that other people make. And I just think when you say to people, when you kind of explain to them, how many examples can you give people where they're like, oh yeah, of course, why did you buy that? Well, I bought it was cheap. Yeah, but did you really buy it because all your mates had it? People understand that these assumptions are completely false, but they can't connect the two, and policymakers can't connect the two to decide that well, maybe the information you're given from a policy should be, if not ignored, certainly challenged, and we should hear an alternative, and that's what's not happening.
And that's why somebody like John Harvey's handy. He's got that book prior to the one he's got out at the moment, which is about all the different disciplines, all the different sort of schools of thought.
That's right, yeah.
And I've listened to him talking, through every single chapter. I don't know if you've heard him talking about it.
Yeah,
but it's absolutely fantastic because you see the world from a different perspective from every school of thought.
That's what his talk is at the Festival of Economics.
Right,
Thursday the 19th. He's opening the festival and he's doing that contending perspectives. And
right,
it's just,
that's right.
Because people who are there, a lot of them will only think that there's one view of the economy, and he's going to show the usefulness of having a much broader approach to how we manage the economy.
Yeah, so you can learn from every one of these schools.
Absolutely.
Even, dare I say it, the Austrian school. You could probably learn something from the Austrian school.
We'd be getting very technical, but certainly there's insights from Austrian economics which are useful for sure.
Yeah, which we would probably regard as being like the exact opposite of modern monetary theory type approaches.
But when it doesn't say much when it's talking about money, but it really talks about the market as being a really good way to allocate scarce resources. Which is, it also talks about the concept of corporate government capture. Right, and that's one of the areas where Austrian economics is really strong. And again, you're like, yep, that is a real danger. So there are insights from even schools that you 99% disagree with, and that's what a heterodox economist does. Whereas an orthodox economist says, no, I've got these assumptions and these axioms, and they cannot be challenged, and I'm not even listening to a psychologist. And that's the other thing about heterodox economists. If a psychologist says to you, people don't make decisions like that because I've analysed the way their brain works, a heterodox economist goes, oh, really? Tell me more. An orthodox economist says, well, we can't use that because that completely debunks our whole foundations. Like you said, if people are socially influenced, then I can't model that. So I can't open myself to those those critiques of my system because I can't model it mathematically. That's how weak that whole neoclassical orthodox economics is. Okay,
well, that's quite a good foundation for our chat because it tells the listeners where we're coming from. Which is that we're probably not neoliberal economists. So in the context of that, let's chat about your paper that you did with Dirk.
Well, it's a very nice segue, Jim, okay? Because what our paper says is that one of the founding principles of modern neoclassical economics is this idea that governments must have fiscal rules.
Yeah.
And we can go into what fiscal rules are, but this is a core principle. If you're advising any government, if you're working for the World Bank or the IMF or the ECB or the central bank or any central bank, you will say, no, the government needs to control its day-to-day spending. It has to have a fiscal rule. That's neoclassical kind of 101. And we looked at fiscal rules and we thought, well, actually, what are they and what impact do they have? And then the third thing we looked at is, well, what would happen if Scotland became independent and followed a fiscal rule? So we really got into those details, but from a heterodox perspective of saying, we don't need them. This is the impact. Why would this happen? Why would this be a terrible idea? So an orthodox economist would never look at fiscal rules like that because they would just simply say, government spending crowds out the private sector. It can make you insolvent. It's very dangerous, so you shouldn't do it. We need these rules to stop governments just printing money and spending. They would never go into the level of detail that we were able to go into because we questioned the very assumption that a government needs a fiscal rule.
Yeah, can I just stop you there for a second? Just to ask you just again to give some context to the paper. Tell me a wee bit about why Dirk Ehnst might be the man to talk to you about this in terms of writing this paper and how you kind of collaborated with him and kind of got to him about it in the first place and ended up writing this paper.
So Dirk's been writing about the impact of the allocation of resources across Europe. He started doing his economics as an economic geographer. Like a lot of my favourite economists, actually, Danny Dorling's another example. Brett Christophers is another example of people who study the economy through a geographical point of view. And he was just saying that what he was told when he was doing his postgraduate or his doctorate was that what should happen is across Europe, prices in some places of labour is cheaper. So it's a lot cheaper to make a product in Poland. So businesses would all start setting up in Poland, and then Poland would eventually have more exports than imports, and the whole European system would balance. And then he was looking at all the evidence. He was saying, this is not happening.
Yeah, of course.
Germans would rather take their factory to somewhere that spoke German than somewhere that spoke Polish. So these things have a big impact. And the idea of fiscal rules was that you had to keep government spending right across Europe very similar to what everyone else was spending. Because if you didn't do that, it would completely skew the market. And fiscal rules was a way to make sure that one government wasn't spending more money than any other government, crowding out investment in this place or unbalancing the whole of Europe. So he's been looking at this for a long time. He now works in the European Parliament. And he was just saying the evidence is that when Europe doesn't have a fiscal rule, it performs better. And ergo, if Scotland has a fiscal rule, you could probably say that it won't perform as well as if it didn't have a fiscal rule. So he was the perfect person to speak to. He knew nothing about Scotland, and he learned loads from this process. And I was able to kind of mine his really deep understanding. And he tells this brilliant story, which he's heard secondhand of, where the fiscal rule came up with. So very, very briefly, the fiscal rule in Europe is that you can't spend more than 3% of a government deficit every year. So you've got to if you collect let's say 100 billion in taxes, you can only spend 103 billion in government expenditure. You can't spend any more than 3% more income than you collect, and that's the fiscal rule, 3%. And overall, you can't have a stock of debt more than 60% more or 60% bigger than your GDP. So these are the two key parts of the fiscal rules. And this 3% was decided in a back of a taxi ride in Europe, where they were just deciding, and someone says, well, what number will we have for this fiscal rule that we need? And the French person said, well, ours is traditionally round about 2.5%, and I need a little bit of wiggle room, because if I go back to my boss and say I've agreed a fiscal rule that's way beyond France's, I'll lose my job or I'll get in trouble. And the guy said, okay, well, what about 3%? And he went, that sounds fine. And that was it. So the idea that this would, months or years of experience, detailed models and speaking to loads of people and modeling the impact, no, that was it. They just needed a figure that they knew everyone would agree with, which was bigger than 1 and smaller than 5.
Yep.
And they came up with 3. And this is what the whole of pretty much the neoliberal northern global north now focuses on, is this 3% figure, and it's completely made up. Yeah. And this is just maddening. So this is why Dirk was such a good person to have involved in looking at the details of the paper.
Yeah, no, I've heard this story before. I mean, I think I spoke to him on here, I don't know when it was, it might have been a year ago, I can't remember, maybe less than that. And I remember him telling me that tale. And also there's a bit of it in his book, if I could remember the name of the book, can't remember the name of anything, but is
that the Modern Monetary Theory book thing?
That'll be the one, which I've read most of, I think, because I've mined it for things that I've written in my articles. It just
on my shelf over there. Yeah. But he does talk about that. It is an anecdote, but even without that story, there is absolutely no evidence that 3% is better than 5%.
Yeah, that's
or
right.
7% or 9%.
And of course, the whole sort of idea that by spending money, you're taking away possible sort of investment from the economy, because that's how the whole. I can remember the name. Crowding out.
Yeah,
as if crowding out was actually a thing. Crowding out itself is complete and utter nonsense. So it's like. Nonsense piled on top of nonsense, piled on top of nonsense.
Absolutely. But as you said, going back to your foundations, if you're a policymaker and someone comes to you and says it has to be no higher than 3% because we're in danger of, and this is the story that I'll take you through. You say to a policymaker, it can't be any higher than 3% because the more money that government spends, it crowds out private sector investment, and it's private sector investment that delivers growth.
Well,
so the policymaker says, well, that makes perfect sense to me. I need to support a fiscal rule if that's the story. The unfortunate thing is that's a made up story, but you can see logically why this makes sense. So this is why we wanted to go straight for this fiscal rule, and the paper is built on the current plan for Scottish independence that says that the government will copy the European Union's fiscal rules, which is the 3% and the 60%.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that's interesting.
Which is madness.
It is madness. I mean, it's funny. I bang my head against all this stuff, as I'm trying to both learn it and write about it, So, and then of course I get quite a lot of. I don't know if you've ever read any of my stuff, but most of the stuff that's interesting is in the comments when people are attacking.
I read lots of your stuff, Dirk, just so you know.
But there's one that I've got at the moment. It's got a lot of comments.
It's like the private sector debt, I think you'd looked at in the last one, was it not?
Yeah, that's right. I basically sort of says that the private sector does not sort of make money within the private sector. You can only get, well, not in money, it does make money, but what I mean is it doesn't add any net financial new assets, financial assets, which is like, for somebody who's like a orthodox economist and who's concentrating on the private sector being the growth, the thing that grows the economy. It's like, this guy's absolutely mad, He's coming out with this stuff, which is rubbish, obviously, meaning me. I'm coming out with this stuff
which you can prove that you can prove with a simple accountancy.
Yeah, exactly. So I threw in some stuff about the sectoral balances there in the article, which is very, very, very simple, which, to me, it's like almost like a closed box idea. You've got this amount of money and it's divided, these things are flowing back and forward. That's just a mathematical, or not arithmetic, simple sort of arithmetic proves what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But that's never enough for people,
That's why we did. I mean, the paper that we've got, it looks at the fiscal rules, and we also introduced Scotland's sectorial balances. Right. And I think in the kind of clamour to show to the Scottish government that this was a terrible idea of this 3% fiscal rule, we kind of didn't do ourselves enough justice in the fact that we've created Scotland's sectorial balances. No one had ever done this before.
Yeah, no, I found that really interesting. Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to republish this with the latest figures, and make much more of a splash about it, because the sectorial balances prove some. It's prove as much as you can using the data that you've got for a sub-national economic region, which is what Scotland is. It's really difficult because it's not captured at that level regionally as a state, but it shows lots of weaknesses of the Scottish economy that you can only see by using the sectorial balances. But it was exceptionally useful to demonstrate, and this is the point that I'll cover now, it's exceptionally useful to demonstrate that if there's a fiscal rule of 3% and you can't go any more, then that money has to come from somewhere else in the economy. And this was the thrust of our argument.
Yeah, I remember I reread my notes this morning and yesterday. And the idea, basically, so you're looking at the Scottish deficit at the moment. What can maintain a Scottish economy to be healthy? And what you're saying, from my memory, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is you really need a 10% deficit for this to maintain the health of the Scottish economy. And the story within the paper is that, if the Scottish government, who are saying in their own papers that they are going to buy into the EU's deficit limits, their what do they call it again? I can never remember the name of anything.
Stability and Growth Pact.
Stability and Growth Pact, which sounds great. Who wouldn't want a Stability and Growth Pact?
Yeah.
I would love that.
Tim Rideout calls it the Unstability and No Growth Pact.
Yeah.
That's which I think Dirk Ehnst liked when he heard him say that.
Yeah, Tim's quite good at these things. He's quite direct.
Yeah.
That's
exactly where we are. And what we tried to show using the sectorial balances was that if you assume, and again, there's definitely an assumption here, but if you assume that currently the UK government is spending about 10% of Scotland's GDP to subsidise the UK economy, subsidise the Scottish economy. If you assume that, and that's a big assumption, but not an absolutely huge one, because I'll explain why. But if you say that the government needs 10% now, and the Scottish government's going to go to 3%. That sounds like a brilliant thing, right? Because you're like, great, the government's debt or spending's gone down from 10% to 3%. And that's what the politicians in Holyrood are all excited about. Great, we'll only have 3% deficit. This is brilliant. But what the sectorial balance is and what the paper does is say, but hold on a minute, right? Where does that 7% reduction come from? Right? If you were at 10 and you're now at 3, then there's 7% of GDP that must come from somewhere else. Assuming that the GDP is the same size, then that spending that the government's not doing must come from somewhere else, right? And if the foreign sector surplus if the foreign sector is in surplus, which it is, it can't come from the foreign sector. So it can only come from the other sector and sectorial balances, which is Scottish households and businesses. Yeah. So basically what the sectorial balance proves, if you believe the assumptions and the mathematics that we've got in the model, it's that a 7% reduction in government spending can only come from a 7% reduction in spending from Scotland's households and businesses. And that has another name. That's called austerity.
Yeah.
So this is what the paper says. I hate to use the word prove because I don't think everything is ever proven. But using the methodology, we've proved that 7% has to come from Scotland's businesses and households because we run a deficit, or the foreign sector has a surplus with us. So it proves that this will lead to significant austerity in Scotland if we're independent. And I would go as far as saying I would stand in front of any economist or any policymaker and say, this is proven it, so you disprove it. And we haven't been able to have that conversation yet with the Scottish government.
Well, I mean, what this highlights again is just the different assumptions between, a modern monetary theory or an economist that's not buying into the orthodox and the neoliberal, and the neoliberal economist who thinks that a government debt is the problem, because they treat the government as if it's like a business. Oh, well, you're in debt. Well, that's a problem. We need to find that money from somewhere. We won't have to earn that money. Whereas, of course, somebody like ourselves realise, well, it's the debt that's the problem is the debt if it's in the private sector. Not the debt with a government like the UK, which actually issues the UK pound. And any kind of government debt is not going to impact current or future spending, no matter what size it is, because it's a number on a spreadsheet, on an account. Now, It's not as simple as that, of course, as you know, because if you've spent into the economy, that does things within the economy and that might have impacts in other ways. But essentially, UK government issues the UK pound. What does the word debt mean in this context? Well, we can understand that if you issue the currency in that debt, then that's a different kettle of fish if in terms of what is meant by the word debt. In a business or personally, if I'm in debt, if I've got £1 million in debt and I'm an individual, well, actually, that's a problem with the bank. But
if it's that much. Yeah.
But there's a different way of looking at it. But if I'm a business and I'm in debt, then I can go bankrupt. So it's a different kettle of fish. But the orthodox economist thinks about the government as if, the classic word is household or business.
Absolutely.
They think a debt is a bad thing. So they're not seeing it in the same way as you're describing it in this paper. They have a different view of what it is.
And that's why the sectorial balance is so powerful. Yeah. I was interviewed on another podcast and someone said, have you used MMT in this 23-page paper? And I said, I don't know. And then they did a find and replace and they found it in the reference section. Right, so we didn't use the words MMT or modern monetary theory, not deliberately, because it just wasn't, because this is explaining the impact of fiscal rules on the economy. So we didn't need the MMT lens for that. Yeah. But it does highlight that you can see clearly that the Scottish government have a completely orthodox understanding of the economy, and this is like a little thing that peeps above the cracks that say, well, you can assume if they think that fiscal rules is something that they really need to have, you can assume that they think that the government has to borrow
Yeah, exactly.
From the private sector.
Exactly.
You can assume that they want to keep the overall debt. You can make all these assumptions because it's all built on this framework. And as I said, fiscal rules is now the central piece of a whole neoliberal way to change the rules of the games and manage the economy. And we didn't really address that in the paper, but it's the big flashing red light that says that if this administration took us into independence, it would be as neoliberal, and I'm hesitant to say this, if not more neoliberal than the UK governments we've had for the last 40 years, because this is what the evidence is saying. Yeah. And the fact that they've completely ignored this very detailed paper, it shows you that they're like those orthodox economists who are just saying, well, it's too much. I've described it in the past as kind of, they're driving along on the little bus and they're saying kind of, being members of the European Union and following the European Union will save us all, and this is the destination. And then you've got this kind of paper that Dirk and I have written is like a big bus that comes from the side and says to them, well, actually, that could even make things worse. So it's just too much of a kind of shift from direction for them to engage with. But as I said, they really need to look at this paper and say, you're wrong because of X, Y, and Z. And they haven't done that because this is a really well-sourced, referenced, solid bit of work.
I mean, there's a couple of things that makes me think of when you say that. One is one of the things I was going to come up to next, which was the idea of Scotland, an independent Scotland, using the UK pound rather than having its own currency in those initial years. So that's something we can come back to. But the other thing I always think about, when I was reading your paper initially and when I listened to you and some of the other podcasts, the problem is that the UK government and the Scottish government and all the other governments are the orthodox story. They are all friends together saying something which they all understand and is not unusual. What you're saying and what I'm saying is the outlier. And the kind of, from their perspective, the madness, so to speak. So from that, and there's something I want to say about that, which is, it's not about the actual thing. It's about the type of approach I think that maybe we have to take, which is not to other them, because we are the other, if you know what I mean. It's hard to blame the Scottish government or the UK government for being the same as everybody else. So there's something in there. I always think about there's something in there about how we should behave, given that they are seeing themselves as part of the normal. This is the truth. You're an outlier, rather than why are you people so stupid? When you're believing the same as everybody else,
absolutely,
it's a struggle to.
You're right. J.K. Galbraith says that the position of strength is with the conventional wisdom, and trying to suggest something that's not the conventional wisdom is exceptionally difficult, and that's where we are with our approach. But within the paper, we take we evidence that. We say that there's countries in the world who don't have fiscal rules who are doing absolutely fine. You can't say Scotland would ever be like China. It's a ridiculous thing, but you can say that China has got no fiscal rules and regularly has between 5 and 10% government deficits every year. But you can mention other countries. A lot of them look at it and say, well, we'll manage government spending not on a fiscal rule but on other measurements. So you've got that as evidence, but you can also say that the economy worked as well as it did now in the 1990s before fiscal rules. Fiscal rules are relatively new. They only came with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. Gordon Brown introduced them in the UK in 1997. But the 2,000 years before that, there was no such thing as fiscal rules. So they just appeared and we all started gravitating towards them. So the evidence is there that they didn't change the economy for the better. And when you explain the impact of fiscal rules, who is affected by it, and again, I think we do that in the paper, then you can say someone's making a decision, and this is a man-made decision. Someone's making this decision, making an argument. Who does it affect? this is all decisions that a government can take. If they want to make these decisions and hurt the poorest, most unfortunate in society, they can do it. But if they want to make alternative decisions, then and support the poorest in society, and and move towards a just transition and a net zero, and spend for investment, and consider kids' education as investment rather than day-to-day spending, all of these things can be done. It's really important to say to the listeners that there's so many decisions that the government make, and economists are saying to them, I'm really sorry, this is just how it is. This is how our economy works. And they're like, all right, okay, fair. Whereas the discussions I'm having with politicians is to say, you've got much more ability to control the economy than you think you have. And this leads us into the Scottish government and saying to them, if you issue your own currency, you do not need to borrow it from anyone. In fact, Finance Minister, it's impossible for you to borrow money that you haven't already spent. It's just an impossibility. It can't be done. And when you say this to them, they're so taken aback. They're like, that doesn't make sense. So you need to have that framework where we say to them, well, this is how money's created. This is where it comes from. This is what borrowing actually means. This is a decision that you're taking. And it's so much information for a finance minister who's like, well, tomorrow I've got my autumn statement. Next week, in 6 months, I've got my spring statement. I need to be doing all. It's such a huge kind of shift in how you manage an economy. But because Scotland's looking at independence in maybe a decade's time, all of our politicians have got the time and the effort to learn how to create a progressive economy for an independent Scotland, and that they're not doing it is definitely a dereliction of duty. They don't have that excuse that other politicians have, because they should be saying, you're promising a progressive world, explain to me how we get there. And at the moment, they're too kind of caught up in the day-to-day to really have that, I think, that intellectual curiosity to find out more about a heterodox approach to the economy.
Yeah, I mean, again, I suppose it's about language. I mean, I was listening to you on the Indie podcast just on Friday there. And the dereliction of duty idea, I'm not really sure that's the right way to approach it, given that they think they're doing the right thing and that everybody else is doing exactly the same as them. Because it's quite aggressive, it's a kind of aggressive thing to say to folk. And it's an aggressive thing to make as I'm only sort of testing the waters here, so don't worry, it's not like a personal attack, it's just devil's advocate. So I'm always kind of thinking, okay, as an independent supporter myself, I have a similar kind of background in terms of the independence referendum, bringing me back into the idea of economics, the same way as it brought you back in. And I'm always trying to think about the language of how we bring people along rather than feel as if we're attacking them, which just pushes them away, so to speak. And the politicians are particularly thin-skinned people, because they really just want, they want to be liked and they want people to vote for them and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they don't do things unless they think that the voters have changed rather than the politicians round about them. They're interested in making sure that they reflect rather than create a new path and they can't bring everybody along with them. So they need to see change. It's something to do with something you mentioned earlier about just the idea of when everybody is starting to move towards something else and the orthodox change, they will change then.
Yep.
So we've got to somehow change the perceptions out with their wee world so that they change.
Yeah, I know where you're coming from, and I agree in part with it, but the evidence doesn't suggest that necessarily has to be the case, because in the late 1970s, the UK economy shifted as dramatically, possibly more dramatically than we would be suggesting, by abandoning fiscal rules. And the introduction of monetarism in that kind of 2-year period significantly changed the direction of the UK economy.
That was a cultural thing. That was seeded by the media and all sorts of stuff.
Absolutely. But change can happen. Change happened very quickly, and this change didn't happen because the voters were saying, "Oh, please start measuring M1 and against M2 and making sure that the government's spending it doesn't. And I would say another example is what happened with austerity. No one wanted austerity in 2000 and 2008. No one was calling for it, but it it was a 2% overall reduction of real government spending over that period. It's linked to 300,000 people dying. So the economy significantly changed. And you can look at COVID for the changes from COVID. So these changes are possible.
Yeah, but again, I know what you're saying.
You have to be more demanding to have this significant change. And you're just, I suppose, it's kind of like, George Osborne was hoping, he was looking around for things to reduce government spending, and he went, great, I'll see these reports, that's brilliant, I'll go with it. Politicians right now are not looking around thinking, how do I spend more government money? So it does make it more difficult. But I still think you've got to challenge people. And Richard Murphy at the weekend did this great presentation, and he says, my advice to any campaigner is to be disagreeable.
Yeah.
If you want real change, you need to show that you disagree with what's happening. And I think one of our big problems is we've got these progressive think tanks, and all they come up with is the flicking the pea at the charging rhino, is the mucking about on the fringes. So in principle, I agree with you, but I think practically my approach is certainly different from the nice guy that you are, Jim.
I'm not trying to say that.
Because you are.
I'm trying to figure it out. If you listen to, I'm not saying I know the answer. Who does? I'm not saying I know the answer. But what I can kind of see as big cultural changes lead to big changes in economic approaches. Like post-war, Steve Keen is very big on this idea, who I've also had on here, and with all these charts and all that kind of stuff. He is a smart guy, and a lot of the stuff he would talk about is kind of beyond my comprehension. But I get the general gist of it all. So one of the things he talked about when he was on was how the neoliberal creed has always failed on its own terms. So he looks back at post-war, when Keynesianism came in, which is kind of the exact opposite of the neoliberal creed in some way, and none of it kind of what's the word I'm looking for, says, oh, the neoliberal creed is correct about big government or big government spending. None of that works. It doesn't. It's not sort of held up by what happened in practice when the government started paying for education, health, built lots of houses, blah, blah, blah. The government was more involved in the private sector and had larger deficits. None of that supports the neoliberal creed. Right? So the evidence is not there to support what they're saying. And in the 70s came along, and there was an opportunity because of the culture change. You remember in the 1980s and the late 1970s, we had the kind of very financialized, everything was about money grabbing, and there was a whole cultural change. The economic things come on the back of all these big cultural changes.
No, but but where did the cultural change? Who propagated the cultural change?
Well, that was, of course, individuals with lots of money. Promoting a particular creed through the media, through the papers, through the television, through.
That's when we had all of the think tanks. That's when all of the think tanks landed in the UK in the 1970s.
Exactly. So I'm not saying
an egg thing, isn't it?
I'm not saying that what you're saying is not part of that. It clearly is, because more people get angry, more people that shout, the more people create a sense of a change. And that's actually happening at the moment with people like the leader of the Green Party in England. We're getting people. So maybe there is a cultural change which is going to turn the wheel again. Yeah. And you're part of it, by what you're saying, because you're connected with the government. So I suppose in some sense, the thing to say to the politician is not the technical thing, or that you're an idiot. The thing to say to the politician is, look out your window. Things are changing out there. The world is changing. Yeah. And you should be part of the change.
Yeah,
how can you do that?
Absolutely. And I think that's really valid. I think that's a role for other people. I think my role is to sit in a room with 4 other people who say, oh, you can just tweak around the edges, First Minister, and things are better. And I think my job is to emphasise the things that we say in this paper, that, well, if you make this decision, it'll lead to austerity that's more severe than what happened in Greece after the financial crisis, First Minister. I think that's if I've got a job in anything, I think that's my job. And the new paper that we've done with the bond, we're looking at Scotland's decision to release wholesale bonds. My job is to say to the First Minister, how can you possibly release a bond that's got 10 years and not consider the impact of independence? That, First Minister, is a dereliction of duty. Because it is. If you're a government who's standing on a mandate to say that we will push for Scottish independence, you have £3 billion worth of debt in a foreign currency, and you haven't instructed anyone to consider what would happen if Scotland's independence. This is a gross dereliction of duty, and I'm never going to not say that because the evidence is there. You know that whether or not it changes his mind.
You know that I 100% agree with everything you're saying, William. You know that, right? There's nothing you're saying I don't agree with, either on the bonds or in the paper here with the what is in the Scottish Government's paper. I disagree with what they're doing, obviously, and I agree with what you're saying. I suppose maybe what I'm thinking about, again, I'm not the oracle, and I suppose it's my approach might be not to say it publicly, but to tell them privately. Because what's important is that they change, but what's also important is that we get independence. And in that context, is that people don't decide not to vote because they think, oh, well, it's going to be a disaster because the economy is going down the drain, because that has become the sort of story. That if they do that, because they're bad people, these SNP, they don't have a clue what they're doing, then the story's not a good one. And I suppose that kind of upsets me when I hear that.
Yeah, and I can completely understand that. But I am a political economist. What I need to do is tell people the impact of the policies that are being made, and that is a danger. But there's also a danger that we have independence and the government introduce a fiscal rule, and it leads to tens of thousands of people dying unnecessarily. Because that's what happens.
So you should say that to them.
So you've got to, and if that means that we never become independent, then people are making the decision on the evidence, and that's all as an economist I can hope to do. I mean, it's unfortunate. I would love to be saying the SNP are great and they're making loads of brilliant decisions about our future. These guys our economy's safe in their hand. I mean, that's the easy story. I would love to be doing that, but when you look into this, you see the evidence is unfortunately quite the contrary. But what I would like to say, and I think this is important, is we haven't spoke about the wholesale bonds, and it's fairly technical. I don't think we need to go into detail, but basically the Scottish Government are doing something that's not a very good idea, and we've criticised it and said here's an alternative. But it's important to say, if this was a Labour administration or a Reform or a Tory, they would do exactly the same thing. So we're not criticising the SNP, we're criticising the conventional wisdom. The Green Party or the Scottish Socialist Party or the only party who would say, let's not supercharge foreign direct investment and the financialisation of Scotland's resources. But every other party would. So we are criticising the SNP because they're in power, but we're more focused on this understanding of how the economy works. I think that's really crucial, because if we have independence, we need people who understand the economy differently from what this administration does. And I'd happily go on the record and say
no, I totally agree with that. As I say, it's not that I don't agree. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. Obviously, we're both on the same side. I suppose I'm always impacted personally by things. It's like I got on well with Steve from Macro and Cheese, as you know. I've had him on as well. We tend to disagree in quite a lot of things. we don't argue, but he actually has got a similar kind of idea. Well, Jim, you're always trying to placate people, and that doesn't work, Jim.
Well, I'm not going to tell you to change your ways in the way that I know you wouldn't change mine. But and anecdotally, I am dealing with a lot of MSPs and policymakers now, and I think my approach is working, because I genuinely think that the other people who are similar to me are saying very different things, either from the right or definitely from the right, but also people from the left who are saying things like, "We'll just find £2 billion worth of tax." And I'm saying to them, no, show that the UK government is not spending enough money. Take that route. Look at who you're putting the tax towards. Line this to independence. Move away from your fiscal rules. So these are all things that do make politicians uncomfortable. But there's a lot of MSPs who want to make life uncomfortable for the administration because they don't agree with the direction that they're going. And that's important. People within the parliament want me to be really vocal against the SNP because they don't believe that this current administration is going in the right direction.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing that makes my perspective slightly different is I always tend to think that you don't change things from the inside, you change them from the outside. You can't change economic policy by talking to politicians or talking to the person that makes the policy. You have to change them by putting pressure on them. That is the pressure that they might not get voted in. So the change comes from out with the government itself. Comes from. Well,
I kind of disagree with you there, but not enough to be.
Yeah.
But because that, fiscal rules are a perfect example. Yeah. Fiscal rules were no one asked for them. There was no pressure externally. An economist said, you need fiscal rules. All the policymakers went along with it. And those fiscal rules changed the rules of the game for the economy. They changed it completely. And if you would have gone in there and if you'd been in that meeting and been able to argue against fiscal rules and they weren't introduced, big change. J.K. Galbraith's son was in a meeting and he ensured that full employment was taken as part of the Fed's mandate in the 1970s. If he wasn't in the room making that argument, he's in his 20s, that full employment wouldn't have been part of it. So I disagree. I think it is getting the right people in the right room at the right time.
Although these are all, again, devil's advocate, these are all details within the same economic framework.
Apart from full employment, though, a pretty significant, maybe one of the most significant things any heterodox economist has done in the UK in the US in the last 50 years is Jamie Galbraith putting full employment as a mandate for the Fed. Right, so that's not to be underestimated. But I do take the general point that changing the fiscal rule from 3% to 3.5% isn't really going to make any difference. Yeah. But getting rid of a fiscal rule will, as an example.
But the framework itself needs to be revolutionised. The plugging things in and taking things out.
Reaching to the confirmed brother.
you have said the same thing.
And that is what I'm trying to get. I'm trying to get the Scottish government to understand that a fiscal rule comes naturally out of the economic framework that they believe.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it seems really natural because if you, as we said at the start, if you have these assumptions, then a fiscal rule looks like a brilliant thing to do. And I am speaking to MSPs and the occasional minister and saying, look, this is the system that supports austerity. This is how much you need to change. Your values have to change, your primary targets, your methodologies. All of this has to change if you want the type of economy that you want. You can't, as you said, Jim, you can't tweak this from the inside. This has to be structurally, institutionally redesigned. And that's my huge problem with this idea of Scottish independence, is that the current administration just sees it as kind of like, let's be like the UK light, or a nicer version of the UK that maybe gives a little bit more in social security spending, but nothing else will change. And I'm trying to get across to whoever will listen that you will not have the type of economy that most people in the independence movement want unless you completely restructure the system. And that's not difficult to do because it's supported by the lens that you and I use, which is modern monetary theory. It's supported by a feminist economy lens and ecological economics,
behavioral economics.
Yeah, absolutely. A real focus on resilience and not growth. This is all there. It's all there, waiting to be picked up in the way that monetarism was and neoliberalism was in the 70s. It's all there. We just need an administration bold enough to take that step, and that's what we don't have in Parliament. And I'm so enthused by the idea that I think it's something like a third of the members in the next intake in Holyrood are going to be new.
Yeah, I heard you saying that. That's interesting. Yeah,
I mean, that's a huge opportunity for anyone who's, progressive to influence the direction of Scotland's economy now and in the future.
Yeah,
I'm not
so
going to let that spy.
People to talk to, and then are the people that are going to become the next set of, well, MSPs initially, but
Absolutely.
MPs in independent Scotland eventually. Those are the people to influence, I think. One of the things, for example, I think that students are the most kind of easy to target in terms of making a change for the future. Education is so important, but students are still getting taught neoliberal economics as by default at the moment. So that tells me that the world in the future is going to be the same as the world is today, unless those students learn something else. Those are the people that will be getting jobs as economists later on. I mean, as I say, I think I do sense that that's changing a bit. I mean, I kind of target, in terms of trying to get people at MMT 101, I target students from that are on LinkedIn, because those are the people of the future. And a lot of them are interested in this stuff. There's absolutely no doubt about it. They hear it, and I think because they're young and they're not completely indoctrinated yet, they can see something that makes sense. That they're not getting taught.
The only issue with young folk is they get old. And and they become, George Monbiot tells a brilliant story about his group of 8 people who were all getting ready to demonstrate and burn down the animal testing labs and all this stuff. And he says, and now Johnny works for Barclays Bank, and Sarah is now a senior estate agent, and it is just that that rebellious leaves us, and I think concentrating on the on younger people is really good. But the education is really important. And in Scotland there's not one heterodox economist in a university or a top kind of 6 or 8 universities in Scotland. There's one heterodox economist at Napier, and that's the only heterodox economist I know at a university in Scotland. So of the other maybe 500, maybe even more than that, people who work in economics departments, 499 of them tell you the economy works in one way. And one person says, hold on a minute, it's different. And what a dereliction of duty to our students of the future, that you're not saying to them, hey, here's several different schools of economics. Which one do you think makes more sense to you? I'll support you to learn that. That's not how the education system, it's purely a way to impose this ideology on economic students.
Yeah, which it is. It's an ideology. It's not economics. It's an ideological discipline, ideologically based discipline. That's again something I've written about, because I think that is true.
Absolutely. No,
it's a belief system.
Completely. And the idea that I would get a job teaching MMT at a mainstream university in Scotland is as likely as it is me getting a number 1, in the charts. It's just there is no institutional support for anyone who would talk about an MMT lens and the usefulness. There's not even a kind of a wedge where you could get into this kind of completely closed shop, which is economics, the economics departments and universities in Scotland.
Unfortunately, with those optimistic statements, William, we're going to have to stop. Because,
but let me finish with, but that's why things like this are so important, because we do need to educate people who are outside of that. And again, Jamie Galbraith said fairly recently, I don't try and persuade any other economists to come over to a heterodox understanding now. It's just a waste of time, because they're too, as you said earlier, they're too built into a system that rewards them, that they're no way just going to wake up one morning and say, the last 25 years, when I've been advising you to do something, I've been such a fool. Why did you listen to me? You need to do something different. This doesn't happen. So he's talking about the things that you and I are doing, educating policymakers, the general public, and people who can influence the MPs, because the economics profession is just too embedded in the kind of conventional wisdom. It gets too much from it to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And again, I suppose that informs what I think about who you're trying to educate and who you're trying to change. You can't change the people that are already in the system. They are already being fed by the system. The system is giving them their houses. and their wages and their nice lifestyle.
You're sort of, that's where an institutional understanding, outside of economics helps you, because you understand how people make decisions. People aren't just going to, oh, has that been right? Oh, I've been wrong all the time, I'm going to change. That's not how people change. And, you need to understand that.
Well, I think we'll have to wrap it up there. We've got about 2 minutes left in this particular Zoom thing, this clock at the top there. So,
all right, brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Jim. I appreciate the invite.
Thanks for coming on. I've enjoyed that. Despite the fact that, of course, that I try to be a devil's advocate, I usually kind of sound as if I'm arguing against myself or setting myself up, so to speak, to be knocked down.
Well, hopefully the listeners will have enjoyed our little bit of back and forth, despite knowing that we're basically on the same side.
Absolutely.
If this goes out before 19th, 20th, and 21st, we've got a 3-day festival in Edinburgh, so in Leith. In Edinburgh, we've got around 30 speakers coming, all progressive speakers, about a dozen economics professors or lecturers or political economists speaking, a wide variety of subjects, with a key theme of trying to say to people that there is an alternative to the economic narrative that they hear on all of their mainstream and everywhere else where they pick up their information on the economy. There is an alternative, and we're trying to demonstrate that people who are talking about this stuff know what they're talking about and have solutions.
If they want to come, how do they book?
Yeah, the website is scotteconfest.org. Just click on that and it links to all of the sessions. You can buy a ticket to come for the full day, or you can just pick and choose the sessions you want to attend over the Thursday, Friday and Saturday. We've already sold 400 tickets, so places are selling quickly, but we'd love to see any of the listeners along there.
So, well, thanks a lot, and I'll catch up with you at the conference. Thank you, William. I appreciate you coming on to the MMT 101 podcast. I hope you found that entertaining, particularly our banter as we got into it. All, of course, just me being devil's advocate, so we haven't fallen out in any way. If you're enjoying the MMT 101 podcast, please subscribe, and please be aware this takes me, all the articles and all the videos and all the research takes me quite a lot of time. So if you want to contribute something by becoming a paid subscriber, I would really appreciate it. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye for now.